much. And thanks to the Liam and Tom O'Flaherty Society for the invitation to talk, and especially to Jenny Farrell and Kathleen McMahon, who I've been emailing over the last few months to get this all organised. I was feeling very relaxed about this lecture until about 2 o'clock. And then I met my good friend Deirdre Nicholas from Ireland, who started telling me all the things I didn't know about Liam O'Flaherty, which is an awful lot, I'm afraid. And I very much hope that I get to talk to some of you afterwards, and you'll be able to fill some of those gaps in my knowledge about O'Flaherty. What I mainly want to talk about tonight is a sort of specific period in O'Flaherty's life, between about 1922 and 1925, mainly, when he got his break as a writer, thanks to his meeting with Edward Garnett. I want to begin this evening's talk with a longish quote from the second volume of Liam O'Flaherty's autobiography, Shame the Devil, published in 1934. In it, Liam recounts how he managed to get his first novel, Thy Neighbour's Wife, published. In many ways, it was the key moment in his writing life. The place is London, the time, late 1922, the Irish Civil War dragging on, O'Flaherty keeping his head down after his failed declaration of a workers' republic at the Rotunda. I had finished and rewritten my novel and immediately brought it to a publisher's office. When I had done so, I lost heart. I felt ill and exhausted. I was half-starved and crazy for want of sleep. What with working late into the night and being tortured by the bugs. One morning, about 10 days after I had submitted my manuscript, I decided to leave my garret, go down to the East End and try to stow away on a ship for New York. On my way, I called at the publisher's office to collect my manuscript. I did not want to leave behind me what had given me so much joy, hope, pain and misery. To my astonishment, they told me in the office that the publisher himself wished to see me. Now, when I was invited to go upstairs to the publisher's private office, the same fear returned. Were there detectives up there waiting to pounce on me? Had I written something in my manuscript that would give a handle to my persecutors? What persecutors? The kind English faces of those in the office, who were smiling in gentle amusement at my distraught appearance, reassured me, and I followed one of them upstairs. Then indeed, my astonishment was intense, for the publisher received me as an important personage. I stood before him in my ragged trench coat and leaking shoes, while he told me that he wished to publish my manuscript. I sat down, hardly able to meet his eyes or answer his remarks. So strange did it seem to be treated in this manner. He read me a letter from Edward Garnett advising the acceptance of my manuscript, not because it was likely to sell, but because it was the work of a promising young writer. It is impossible to describe the exalted joy this news gave me. The joy of a lover on realizing that his love is returned is nothing compared to it. I was completely beside my wits. I was convinced that I was already rich, famous, a man of genius. The £10 which the publisher gave me as an advance on royalties seemed an enormous fortune which it was impossible to spend. I wandered through the streets, a little astonished that people passed me without recognition of my exalted merit. What a future! A new world lay ready to my hand, newer than the world which the Spaniards found in the western seas, for it was a fool's paradise that existed only in my imagination. Alas, it soon faded, and I returned once more to the reality of my position, under the wise guidance of Edward Garnett, whom I met a few days later at my publisher's office. This great man has helped and influenced most of the important writers of his generation. To me, his personality and friendship were of incalculable importance. There I was, like the innocent Huron of Voltaire, afloat in a crazy coracle on the sea of London literary life, surrounded by deadly rocks, and yet without a thought for the dangers that surrounded me. Like a father, he took me under his protection, handling me with the delicacy with which one handles a high-strung young colt, which the least mistake might make unfit for racing. It was the first time I had come in close contact with a cultured English gentleman. The calmness of his judgment, the subtlety of his intellect, and the extraordinary nobility of his character were a glorious revelation to me, who had for years mingled almost entirely with rude and brutal types. so that I was only willing that he should fashion the development of my literary talent in whatever way he pleased. Artistic beauty being the only thing of real importance in life to him, I became a fervent disciple of that religion. I abandoned at once all thought of making a success in life, of gaining fame or money. In a frenzy of enthusiasm, I began to write The Black Soul, bringing the manuscript to Garnett page by page, angry when he threw some in the fire, delirious with joy when he said, "This is good." So the most important friendship of O'Flaherty's literary life had begun. So who was this man, Edward Garnett, and why was his patronage so important? Garnett was born on the 5th of January 1868 in London, the third of 6 children of Richard Garnett, keeper of the printed books in the British Museum, and his wife Olivia Narney Singleton. His father's family came from Yorkshire, his mother's from a County Clare big house. At the age of 19, he took a menial job with T. Fisher Unwin, the publisher. There he soon graduated to reading manuscripts for publication, and he quickly showed himself to be a talented reader and spotter of talent. He became friendly with W.B. Yeats, who had begun his London publishing life with T. Fisher Unwin. There are a series of very interesting letters between Yeats and Garnett, where Garnett is trying to counsel him about Yeats's jousting with Charles Gavin Duffy, which Yeats was sure to lose. And Garnett was telling him this. And this is really the beginning of a lifelong relationship with Irish writers. Being a publisher's reader was to be his vocation for the rest of his life, successively with Unwin, Heineman, Duckworth, John Lane, and finally with Jonathan Cape. Once he had recommended an author for acceptance, Garnett felt responsible for developing his talent and promoting his interests. His methods were intuitive. He had a quick eye for character and a ready sympathy, and he took great pains to cajole, or if necessary to browbeat, his authors into revising or even abandoning work that did not reach his high standards. Garnett married Constance Black in 1889. Constance Garnett, as she became, is still remembered as perhaps the single most influential translator of Russian literature into English in the 20th century. I'm sure several of you will have Constance Garnett translations in your own book collection. The Garnetts were at the centre of British literary bohemian life. They had an unorthodox marriage, Edward taking a mistress, the painter Nellie Heath, with the couple remaining on very good terms with each other, and with their only son, David Bunny Garnett, who himself went on to be a successful novelist and a Bloomsbury dandy. In 1894, Garnett accepted Joseph Conrad's first book, Almayer's Folly, and persuaded him not to go back to sea, but to write another. And Conrad is perhaps Garnett's greatest discovery. D.H. Lawrence, another key one, T.E. Lawrence. These are all writers that wouldn't be the writers they were today had it not been for Garnett's cajoling and help and patronage. And he became very friendly with Conrad, who was Anglo-Polish, great writer about the sea, perhaps best known, of course, for Heart of Darkness today. Conrad, though 11 years his senior, nevertheless deferred to Garnett's authority, and Garnett's considerable influence on Conrad's work is perhaps his greatest contribution to literature. In The Inheritors, the 1901 novel by Conrad and Ford Madox Hoofer, Garnett appears as Lee, the dedicated publisher's reader. Lee had helped me a good deal in the old days. He had helped everybody, for that matter. You would probably find traces of Lee's influence in the beginnings of every writer of about my decade, of everybody who ever did anything decent. But Garnett, like any reader, had his likes and dislikes. He disliked Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist, and he rejected it when it was sent in manuscript form to Duckworth's. In his reader's report he said, "James Joyce's portrait wants going through carefully from start to finish. It is too discursive, formless, unrestrained, and ugly things, ugly words, are too prominent. Indeed, at times they seem to be shoved in one's face, on purpose, unnecessarily." Garnett wasn't the only person to think that, of course. Joyce appeared a scandalous writer to most readers of the time. Ulysses was banned in most countries, for instance. And it's also just so highly experimental, a portrait of the artist, that to a traditional reader like Garnett, it would have seemed, I think, a step too far. The firm of Jonathan Cape, established after the First World War and still today one of London publishing's leading lights, poached Garnett, keen to have the most prestigious literary reader in England on their books. At Cape, Garnett published T.E. Lawrence and fostered the careers of many younger writers, notably H.E. Bates, Liam O'Flaherty and Sean O'Faolain. Garnett promoted the cause of the Russian writers translated by his wife and wrote books on Tolstoy and on Turgenev. He also published several unsuccessful novels and plays himself. Partly resulting from his Irish background, of which he was very proud, he considered himself an outsider and was sceptical of all politics and religion. He supported the Boers at the time of the South African War of 1899 to 1902 and wanted to see home rule for Ireland. A conscientious objector, he served in 1915 with the 1st British Ambulance Unit in Italy, and he scorned the establishment and refused all honours in later life. So, everything about Liam O'Flaherty would have appealed to Edward Garnett. Irish, rebellious, energetic, anti-establishment. And as Garnett spotted, he had a reel of unrestrained talent for writing. And so Garnett took a punt on Thy Neighbour's Wife, and thus began a friendship that lasted about a decade. The Garnett family papers are mostly held in the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. I was fortunate enough to go on a fellowship there a few years ago and go through the Garnett papers in some detail. Huge amounts of Liam O'Flaherty's letters to Garnett there. These have all been reproduced in A.A. Kelly's Letters of Liam O'Flaherty, published in 1996, which I'm sure many of you know. The first letter is sent in January 1923, the last in the spring of 1932. Why the correspondence ended, we don't know. Or at least I don't know. Maybe some of you do. But Garnett had a tendency to move on to newer, younger writers as they emerged. And the final two letters sent by O'Flaherty denounce Sean O'Faolain as a writer. The penultimate letter, dated 29th of February 1932, is written in pencil, as though in haste. It was the first letter from O'Flaherty to Garnett in over 4 years. Quite a gap, considering that Garnett had once been O'Flaherty's closest confidant. My dearest friend, I dare say you've thought me a particularly low fellow for quite a long time now, but for me you have remained the finest man I have ever met, together with being the kindest and most joy-giving. I'm writing to you after reading your introduction to S. O'Faolain's book. I think your foreword is great, but that O'Faolain has little in him except a great deal of imitative cunning. I have been wanting to write to you ever since I wrote to you last, but I love you very much, and I feel you don't think much of me anymore, so I didn't. In any case, permit me to thank you once again for all you have done for me and for the joy your existence gives me. You who are the one person in the dismal age of charlatans that makes literature appear a profession worthy of a gentleman. Garnett had written the foreword to O'Faolain's first book, Midsummer Night Madness, a collection of short stories, which again some of you I'm sure will know. I think O'Flaherty's a little bit harsh. I think Midsummer Night Madness myself is a pretty good book. It's a collection of stories mainly about the revolutionary years and O'Faolain's relatively active part in the Anglo-Irish War. Garnett, in that foreword, castigates Ireland and Irish censorship culture in particular. But he rates the book very highly. He says of it, if he were never to write another line after publishing Midsummer Night Madness, I should feel that my hope had been justified. His work, if I may say so, is of a finer artistic quality than his Irish contemporaries. This must have hurt O'Flaherty deeply, for he and O'Faolain had once been close and had toured West Cork together in the summer of 1926, as a letter from Margaret Curtis, or Margaret Barrington, I'll come back to her in a moment, to Garnett tells us. Margaret Barrington, who was Liam O'Flaherty's wife for a time. Liam and I went down to Cork to see an old friend of mine. She has two beautiful children. The eldest, a little girl, is my goddaughter. She's a lovely child and so good and well behaved. We had some nice drives and went out to Gugo and Barlow with a young Cork boy who was a great admirer of Liam. Now that must be Sean O'Faolain. A week before this letter was written, as O'Faolain made his first tentative steps into London publishing, it was O'Flaherty's name he invoked in his first letter of many to Garnett. Dear Mr. Garnett, you must excuse the typescript. I write a vile hand. My friend Liam O'Flaherty has encouraged me to send you an example or two of my work. And as I wish for nothing more than criticism, I am presuming on your patience to the extent of 2 short stories. I trust they will not waste too much of your time. And if you should be busy just now, I assure you that I shall not mind your laying them aside until the coming of the leisure hours. I am not certain that I am not presuming too much in sending them at all. Now, as it happens, Garnett liked what O'Faolain sent him, and they became very good friends. And O'Faolain's letters to Garnett are also in Texas, a fascinating account of Irish literary life in the early 1930s especially. There's something very sad about O'Flaherty's last letters to Garnett. For these men were once extraordinarily close, with O'Flaherty confessing his every fear, concern, joy and achievement to his publisher friend. 1932, the year of these last letters, saw Cape publish The Puritan, but that year also saw O'Flaherty decisively switch allegiance to the more left-wing publishing firm Victor Gollancz, with Skerritt, and in the following year, The Martyr. But clearly, Garnett was no longer his patron. The early O'Flaherty letters to Garnett are respectful and cautious, always beginning, Dear Mr. Garnett. As the relationship flourishes, O'Flaherty sometimes permits himself to open letters Ahara and sign them off Michel Amas. Eventually, my dearest friend becomes common. The friendship was at its most intense between 1923 and 1925, and especially during the composition of The Black Soul, on which Garnett worked very closely and which is in turn dedicated to him. O'Flaherty was living at various English addresses in 1923 to 24, most of them in rural Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire. Frank O'Connor, another of the great Irish fiction writers to emerge out of this period, recalls in his study of the short story, The Lonely Voice, how easy it was to rent such places in rural England. I often think how strange a place rural England must have been in 1922, 23, 24. It must have been a very quiet, empty place, you know, because a whole generation had been killed in Flanders. And, you know, it must have been sort of denuded of a whole stratum of young men. This is how O'Connor describes it. And in those days, a very little money was enough to set a writer free for serious work. There were still plenty of reviews that would pay a guinea for a critical article, and a single man could live for quite a while on a guinea. In spite of their latter-day admirers, the young writers were not violently attracted by rabbits and pheasants, but they were always untenanted mills or barges on the Thames, and one could rent a beautiful Elizabethan cottage without water or light for a few pounds a year. And in those English villages that had been dead for 2 generations, one had the most beautiful background in the world and a personal freedom that was an adequate substitute for life in the Latin Quarter. O'Connor is actually writing about the English writer A.E. Coppard here, but this is also very much O'Flaherty's world of the time. Coppard was one of the writers who O'Flaherty would have met through the Garnett circle. Others of this coterie included the Powys brothers, T.F. and J.C., and H.E. Bates, best known today for The Darling Buds of May. Bates felt so indebted to Garnett that he wrote a short memoir of the man, published in 1950. In it, he gives his impressions of O'Flaherty. But new gods were appearing, and to one of these supper evenings came Liam O'Flaherty, a virile and impassioned Irishman, who rather like me had a facile demon in him. Together over supper, we put our signatures as witnesses to Garnett's will, and some weeks later O'Flaherty rushed excitedly into Cape's office with the unconfirmed report that the 2 sisters had won the Hawthornton Prize. The 2 Sisters was Bates's first novel. a rumour for which there was evidently no foundation at all, though it continued to dog me for some years afterwards. Actually, Juno and the Paycock won the Hawthornden Prize in 1925, and Liam O'Flaherty's The Informer won the James Tait Black Prize in 1925. These were the two most prestigious prizes in English literature at the time, the kind of bookers of the day. O'Flaherty, true Irish, could talk a donkey's hind leg off, and with fierce, blue, unstable eyes, would stand up in the middle of the room and begin reciting flowing nonsense from some as yet unwritten book, until he collared you that it had really happened and was really true. O'Flaherty had arrived in London with a firebrand swagger, a fine talent and a head full of rebellious fury about the English, and had sat down to write pieces of episodic violence about London, which he hardly knew at all. Garnett promptly and rightly sent him back to Ireland to write about seagulls and congers, a peasant's cow and the flight of a blackbird, and he at once produced sketches of the most delicate feeling and visual brilliance that few, even among the Irish, have equalled. If any of you have read any H.E. Bates, you'll know that now he's almost a figure of fun as a rather twee writer of English country life. Those of you who are fans of the great film Withnail and I will know there's a joke about H.E. Bates in there. If you think carefully about that, I'm personally a big fan of the movie. But Bates and O'Flaherty spent a lot of time together, and there was this whole group of young writers around Garnett, around Jonathan Cape, meeting, working together. And I think this was hugely important to O'Flaherty's development. Garnett seems to have fed all of his new writers on the same diet. Chekhov, Turgenev, and Gogol were special favourites, and Garnett sent copies of a whole range of his wife's many translations from the Russian to O'Flaherty, Bates, and the others he took under his wing. As a result, the influence of the great Russians is everywhere evident in Cape's Irish writers of the 1920s and 30s. For O'Flaherty, I think Dostoevsky, with all his furious energy and despair, becomes the exemplar. For Whelan, it is Turgenev who becomes the literary hero. For Padre O'Donnell, it's less clear, but it's important to note that O'Donnell always put politics ahead of writing. Footnote. Edward Garnett was the man who introduced Padre O'Donnell to Sean Whelan in 1932. And of course that became one of the most important literary friendships in the history of Irish writing, when the two went on to edit The Bell together from 1940 to 1954. As well as those Russian writers, Garnett tended to drip feed Conrad and D.H. Lawrence. And D.H. Lawrence, I think, and Conrad, but D.H. Lawrence more so, is a big influence on O'Flaherty. Really, the work that I've begun on Garnett and this generation of Irish writers, it's a very big project, because one of the things I'll have to do is read all of Constance Garnett's translations and see, well, and sort of try to match up what these Irish writers are doing with these Russian writers. I mean, in some cases it's very clear. Whelan very clearly depends on Turgenev and writes about Turgenev's and hero worships Turgenev. With others, it's sometimes not so clear. Anyway, that's another lecture. The intense series of letters sent by O'Flaherty to Garnett, particularly during the composition of The Black Soul, are a mix of literary business, trying to get journals and periodicals to pay for stories, or sketches, as O'Flaherty always called them, arranging for introductions to powerful London editors like Desmond McCarthy and Leonard Woolf, pushing Cape for greater royalties, looking for a slice of American publishing action. Discussions about other writers and the development of O'Flaherty's own novels, especially The Black Soul and The Informer, are frequent. The sketches were rarely discussed except as a kind of cash cow. O'Flaherty writes to Garnett in April 1923, for instance, of the ease with which he writes the stories in comparison with his novels. I am too comfortable here to do justice to The Black Soul, and I will do some more sketches and stories. Between yourself and Chekhov, I find the sketch as easy as plugging a man at 25 yards with a Colt 45 automatic. But even yet, I can't differentiate between good and bad. It's a good job I don't, or I'd get too conceited. McCarthy sent me a note to inquire about my health, We have secured McCarthy all right, although I doubt whether he likes a real raw art. Damn it, I'm looking forward to having a real big talk to you when you get back. I've been a lucky bastard these last few months. It's just as if somebody thrust a shaft into some cellar in my brain and unloosed a store of thought. Gossip, and O'Flaherty's very complex and very messy love life, is the other main subject. These affairs of the heart are frequently mixed with a deep sense of despair, O'Flaherty regularly relapsing into melancholic breakdowns. On the 19th of June 1923, O'Flaherty writes of his latest misadventure. Christ, I'm in a devil of a mess. I've just written to Miss Casey breaking off my engagement. I couldn't do it. It's awful. Terrible torture to injure a friend. She has been a friend to me, the most sacred thing in life, a friend, a comrade. And to make her unhappy, this is awful. It has been killing me for months, driving me mad, wasting my body, trying to make myself love her because she had been good to me. And now I could do it no longer, and it is painful. One gets the impression at this stage in O'Flaherty's life of a man on the run from himself, but with a burning certainty that he is meant to succeed as a writer. A fortnight after his letter announcing the breaking of the engagement, he has moved again, this time to the King's Road, London. I would not like to leave this joint now, since I have moved into it, because the lady who owns it is a painter. It's not fair to inconvenience people in the trade. And damn it, it's an awful trouble moving about. When a man gets a place with a daily bath and no bed bugs, he is naturally afraid to leave it. I'm working like the devil, trying to get my typing up to date, and the fool who owns his typewriter is writing a novel, and I can only get it at odd moments. I wonder what makes bank clerks write novels. Their wives, I suppose. I hate retrying things. There is such a lot that I can do and want to do. The only pleasure is in the moment of creation. There is no pleasure in preparing for the market. And I think that's something that's very clear about O'Flaherty's writing. And you can feel it in O'Flaherty's writing when you read the short stories especially, that they're written at speed, kind of furiously. And for my money, and I know Frank O'Connor agrees with this, and he says so in The Lonely Voice, the short stories are better than the novels because of that way that O'Flaherty writes. And he says to himself, he finds working on the novels torture. Sending in manuscripts to Garnett saying, no, this is no good, revise. This to O'Flaherty is painful stuff. And he much prefers the sketches, as he says himself. The following month finds O'Flaherty back in rural Buckinghamshire, this time the village of North Crawley, having fallen in love yet again. By the way, I find that my affair with Miss Morris was not an affair of an hour. I tried to leave her, but I found I was madly in love with her. So weep for me. Still I am happy. I'm going to live with her. Fool, you say. Very well, I am a fool. I'm going to take Mrs. Coppard's cottage if I can get it. I'm not certain, but I think Mrs. Coppard is A.E. Coppard's mother. Then we're going to live on £3 per week. She's going to leave the child at her home for the winter. And then in spring, if we are tired of one another, we part. I read Turgenev's Clara Village. It's wonderful art, magnificent. I didn't like the story. I don't like any of Turgenev's stories. He adopts the same attitude towards life as I do myself within my soul. So I don't like his attitude. He hurts in the heart. A week later, he has changed his reading diet to another Garnett favourite, but finds he must change again. I've decided to start The Black Soul again, and do it carefully, sticking to the old copy, excepting as far as the construction of the sentences is concerned. I can see now that I was all wrong about my copy of Black Soul. Reading Conrad did the damage. I'm going to read no more of him while I'm working. I'm reading Gogol now. A lot of the Black Soul in O'Flaherty's handwriting is in Texas, in Austin. This is the beginning of the end of The Black Soul. The Black Soul, most of you will know, is it's a second novel. It's structured in seasons, the 4 seasons. And O'Flaherty had terrible trouble finishing it. It's clear that Garnett and O'Flaherty worked extremely closely together on The Black Soul. I mean, there are several times where O'Flaherty says to him, you know, you're writing it, this is your novel, you've written this novel. You know, that's clearly an exaggeration. But you can see, as the months go by, Garnett's hand, Garnett trying to sort of rein O'Flaherty in. And we know from a careful reading of the letters that much chopping and changing was done at Garnett's instigation. This way of writing was new to O'Flaherty. He found it very difficult. To him, instinct was everything, and the classical idea of the writer as clerk or tradesman was anathema. Here he is, now writing from Chop Cherry Cottage, Chinner, in South Oxfordshire, in October 1923. One of the things I'd like to do, as I hopefully take this further, is I'm going to try and go and visit all of these places and see are they still there, to get a sense of what it was like for O'Flaherty to go around these parts of rural England. Nowadays, I looked this up on a map. O'Flaherty would be a constituent of David Cameron, this would be some of the most expensive real estate in England. But then, as Frank Connor said, you could just rent these little farmhouses for half nothing. And clearly that's what he did, just moving from one to another to another. Your criticisms of the end of autumn are, I think, quite correct. Though candidly, any ending that we could give it, other than the real one, must be artificial. I saw the stranger die. The stranger is the central character of the Black Soul. That's what he's called almost throughout. Die in the conception of the thing, and trying to make him live must be, to use Ralph Croghan's language, a bollocks of a business. Ralph Croghan is a pseudonym of O'Flaherty's. He sometimes calls himself General Ralph Croghan. I have felt it all along. The emotion through the whole piece works evenly enough, rising gradually to the climax, and when the climax comes, it's like putting the lid back on a furnace. Granted that this is so, anything we may do with the fellow after Red John's death is puerile. If you will allow me to say so, I fancy you are wrong about Red John and the knife. I know, probably, more about madmen than you do. You see, I had an opportunity of studying them for 6 months or so, from the point of view of a native. O'Flaherty, again, as I'm sure most of you know, had been shell-shocked in the First World War and hospitalised and suffered from what I suppose we now call post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life. So he did know madmen at first hand. Now take Chekhov's Ward Number 6, and you will find that a generalization about madmen is necessarily hopeless. In fact, I would go so far as to say that about the only thing that is characteristic of a madman is a lack of concentration, except in a state of coma. In a state of coma, he's harmless. At the moment, I feel pretty hopeless about life. I'm afraid I will never again write anything but black souls. But then Gogol was an unhappy man, and who can say that unhappiness is not happiness in the extreme? Knowing how desolate he was, in the spring of 1924, Garnett encouraged O'Flaherty to go back to Ireland and write about what he knew best. And so in March 1924, we see him living at 12 South Circular Road, Portobello in Dublin, glad to be home, if despairing of the country's civic life. Well, here I am among the barbarian Irish once more. I really mean it. Since I came back, I frankly have confessed to myself that we are still merged to a great extent in barbarism from the point of view of culture. Fortunately, however, culture is only a very small part of civilization, and it is really delightful to be back. The streets are dirty, everybody is badly dressed, impudent, contemptuous, and surly. And yet there is a freshness about even the dirt of the streets and the surliness of the man from whom one buys a tram ticket that is immeasurably preferable to the smug politeness and devilisher immovability of the Londoner and the Englishman at large. Very quickly, O'Flaherty returns to his old patterns, dieting on Russian literature, breaking hearts, and falling in love. Unfortunately, the next woman he fell in love with was married to an eminent historian, Edward Curtis. Her name was Margaret Curtis, or Margaret Barrington, or Topsy, as she's known affectionately. And he writes to Garnett, and he tells him all about falling in love with Topsy and how he's going to steal her away from Curtis and so on. And Garnett clearly loses patience. One of the problems with what I'm trying to do is that I don't have Garnett's letters to O'Flaherty. I don't know where they are, if any of them have survived. Again, that's something we might talk about later. But it's clear from O'Flaherty's letters to Garnett that Garnett has sent a very harsh letter to O'Flaherty about his womanizing. O'Flaherty writes, "I received your letter and read it carefully. I am sure that I extracted all the juice from its contents. Rather bitter, most of it, considering the nature of some of the advice that you have given me from time to time, both as regards my last wife and as regards women in general. However, I feel quite sure that you write it in no spirit of bitterness or squeamishness or petty irritation. On the other hand, I feel sure that you do not understand my character one bit. That is the personal side of me. I feel equally sure that you understand the literary side of me very, very well, and you like that side of me, and that you like that side of me alone. However, I'm glad you wrote that letter to me. It did me good. Thanks so much for the nice things you said about the landing and about my writing. When anybody else praises my writing, I feel suspicious and somehow discouraged. But when you praise it, I feel overjoyed and confident." O'Flaherty stayed with Margaret Barrington for many years, into the late 30s. They left Ireland, they eloped, went back to England, and by August 1924, O'Flaherty's writing from East Chalden in Dorset. O'Flaherty confides to Garnett, "I have been frightfully lucky in meeting Mrs. Curtis. She just suits me, and we are devilishly in love. Our tastes are similar, and our faults, defects, and vices are identical." 5 months later, they're back in Dublin, broke, friendless, and without prospects. O'Flaherty writes a short and desperate letter to Garnett in January 1925. "My dearest friend, I'm in a very bad condition here and absolutely friendless. Everybody here is turned against me. I have no money. Would you ask Cape to purchase the copyright of my 4 books for whatever he can give?" So he really was back to the wall at this stage. He had no money, desperate. And it's a period where his letters kind of fade away, and fortunately in Texas the letters of Margaret Barrington to Garnett are also there, and Margaret Barrington is writing these rather helpless letters as well. Garnett rode to the rescue again, securing money for O'Flaherty from the Royal Literary Fund. This is a fund that still exists today that Yeats had sought help for Joyce from when Joyce was on his uppers in Trieste. And on the 12th of February, O'Flaherty writes from a recuperation home in Bray. "I'm writing again to thank you. The Royal Literary Fund sent me this morning a cheque for £200. When the cheque arrived, both Margaret and myself were overcome, and we immediately said, 'What a good friend E.G. is.' For I clearly understand, my dearest friend, that I owe this good fortune entirely to you, as indeed I owe everything to you since I began to write." These months were the high watermark of the friendship that gave O'Flaherty his start in the writing world. As you can see, my attempts to restrict this material to one short lecture are pretty hopeless. When I went to try and dig out my notes that I'd taken in Texas a few years ago, thinking that I hadn't taken much, I saw that I had almost 200 pages of notes just on O'Flaherty to Garnett, and just trying to boil it down and give you just a flavour of the friendship. But the letters are the place to go to if you want to follow this up. The A.A. Kelly edited letters, because all the letters to Garnett are in there. I just want to finish, well, that's a bit too abrupt. They tailed off, the friendship tailed off. They did work closely together on The Informer, which was published in 1925. But that was the last novel that there's a lot of toing and froing between them. Why? It's hard to say. Like I said, Garnett was a busy man. He was always moving on to the next bright thing. But he was loyal too, and O'Flaherty stayed loyal to Garnett. He never blackguarded Garnett. And as you can see from the opening quote that I started with tonight, from Shame the Devil in 1934, he said a great time for Garnett then. Garnett died at the same time as the Irish Free State died, 1937. And that sort of love that O'Flaherty had for Garnett remained true for the rest of his life. I want to finish this evening with a brief word about the new book. O'Flaherty published a pamphlet called A Cure for Unemployment in 1931. And it's been reissued here, and you can buy it tonight. in a book called 3 Leaves of a Bitter Shamrock. I had read the pamphlet many years ago when I was a graduate student, and it sort of fascinated me because I knew nothing about the publisher. A bit of work over the last couple of weeks on the publisher. It was published by a man called Charles Lahr, L-A-H-R. In a series of pamphlets called the Blue Moon Booklets. And O'Flaherty wrote 2 of these booklets. He actually wrote the very first one, which was about Joseph Conrad, an appreciation by Liam O'Flaherty. This is the American edition of A Cure for Unemployment. And they were published by this man, Charles Lahr. Lahr's association with O'Flaherty goes back to at least 1926, when he published several O'Flaherty pieces, including an English translation of O'Flaherty's Irish language play, Dorchadas, which I know the Society have looked at in previous lectures. Lahr was involved with a literary magazine in London, a very bohemian literary magazine called The New Coterie, and brought O'Flaherty into the fold. Lahr was born Karl Lahr in Bad Neuheim, Germany in 1885, and moved to London in 1905 to avoid military service. He was at various times an anarchist, a Buddhist, a socialist, a bookshop proprietor, a publisher, and a prisoner. Dean Baldwin provides the best description of Lahr I've come across in his biography of H.E. Bates. H.E. Bates also came into this group. Politically, he was an anarchist, religiously an atheist. He was utterly indifferent to money or success, to the exasperation of his wife Esther, who possessed the common sense of the family. And it's actually in her name these booklets are published. E. Lahr, Esther Lahr, Red Lion Street, London. They owned a tiny bookshop there. He helped virtually anyone who needed to sell review copies for badly needed cash, or who required a night's lodging in London or an agent to sell a manuscript. Charles cut an unusual figure in London in beard and sandals, bicycling everywhere in search of books, which he often refused to sell unless he considered the buyer worthy of them. It's a bit like Vinnie and Charlie Burns. As a sideline, he sharpened razors for barbers. Like most interesting people, he was a bundle of contradictions. He loved literature, yet rarely did more than dip into a book or scan it hurriedly. He professed advanced views, but clung to archaic sexual attitudes, keeping a mistress, but flying into a rage when his wife had an affair. You can see why he and O'Flaherty hit it off. Lahr's bookshop on Red Lion Street took a very important role in the early distribution of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. Its customers and congregants included wealthy connoisseurs of first editions, young writers who were not especially left-wing, and flamboyant figures on the right. One of those flamboyant figures on the right was T.E. Lawrence, who reportedly said that there was, quote, a bit of a saint in Charles Lahr. Up to now, A Cure for Unemployment was a great collector's rarity, and I'm delighted to see it returned to the reading public, thanks to the auspices of the Liam and Tom O'Flaherty Society. And I know that we're going to have a few more words about this pamphlet in a moment. I'd just like to finish by saying that I came to be interested in O'Flaherty as a teenager, I suppose, by just the sheer power of his writing. By the stories especially, stories like The Conger Eel, The Wounded Cormorant. Those animal stories stayed with me. And he's an extraordinarily complex figure, O'Flaherty. Rubbing shoulders with T.E. Lawrence and H.E. Bates, these bohemian figures of 1920s London. And I think there's an awful lot we still have to find out about Liam O'Flaherty. And hopefully, by coming together and working together, we'll figure it all out eventually.